The night I decided to trace the history of the San Francisco 49ers for the third time, I stood on a narrow ridge overlooking the bay. The city lights flickered beneath me like scattered sparks drifting across the dark water. The cold wind pushed against my jacket, carrying the distant sound of horns, footsteps, and voices layered somewhere deep below. There was a weight in that night, a different weight than before. I had walked the pass twice already, feeling the ghosts of the team's story follow me through time. But this time felt sharper, faster, almost like the past was not waiting to be remembered. It was demanding to be confronted. I stared down toward the empty stadium far in the distance. It glowed faintly under the dim sky, quiet and unmoving, yet filled with the presence of everything it had seen. Glory, failure, breakthroughs, collapse, reinvention. The story of the 49ers had never been a straight line. It was a violent rhythm of rise and fall, ambition and heartbreak, explosion and silence. And now, for reasons I could not yet explain, I felt as if I were standing at the threshold of the most turbulent version of that story yet. As I walked down the hill, my steps pressed lightly into the dirt trail. The path twisted between darkened trees, whose branches scraped softly against each other. The wind carried the scent of ocean salt and something older, something that reminded me of iron and dust. It took me a moment to understand what it was. It was the smell of history, the kind of history shaped not by triumphs, but by wounds that never fully healed. This journey was not about reliving victories. It was about uncovering the fractures that made those victories possible. When I reached the city streets, the noise grew louder. Cars rolled across intersections. A bus rattled past. A couple arguing quietly near a street lamp. Life was everywhere, but I felt strangely disconnected from it as I walked. My thoughts were already merging with the past. I saw the city the way it must have looked decades ago. The red glow of tavern signs, the murmur of longshoremen heading home, the thin fog crawling between buildings as if searching for warmth. This was the atmosphere in which the earliest heartbeat of the 49ers began to form. And even from here, generations later, I could feel that pulse. I turned a corner and found myself walking along a quiet road leading toward the old stadium grounds. The streetlights cast thin cones of light onto the pavement, leaving stretches of darkness between them. I felt my steps slow as I approached. The closer I came, the more the air seemed to thicken. My breath felt heavier. My mind began to drift toward memories that were not mine, but somehow felt familiar. Memories of players stepping off buses with duffel bags slung over their shoulders. Memories of coaches lighting cigarettes in the cold morning air. Memories of fans lining up in the chill before dawn, just to feel a piece of something bigger than themselves. There was something haunting about the silence that followed me. It felt as if the story of the team was watching me, waiting for me to open a door it had closed long ago. I approached the gate surrounding the field and placed my hand gently against the metal. It was cold, almost unnaturally cold. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle around me. And then, almost like a distant whisper, the past began to speak. I saw flashes at first, a crowded sideline, a quarterback gripping his helmet with trembling hands, a coach pacing with nervous intensity, a stadium roaring with a sound so powerful it felt like pressure against the lungs. Then the images shifted. Empty bleachers, rain falling against abandoned seats, a team struggling to find identity, a city growing impatient. The past was not offering nostalgia. It was offering truth, and truth has a way of cutting deeper than memory. I stepped into the stadium through a side entrance that hung slightly open. The inside was dark except for a few scattered lights that cast long, weary shadows across the field. The turf looked almost silver under the dim glow, like a surface caught between reality and memory. My steps echoed faintly as I walked toward the 50-yard line. Each echo felt like a reminder that I was trespassing into something sacred. Standing in the center of the field, I let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The seats surrounding me curved upward like an enormous hollow shell. It felt like standing in the middle of a sleeping giant. The stillness was heavy. I could hear my heartbeat. I could hear the faint hum of lights. And beneath those sounds, I could almost hear something else, something deeper, like the distant echo of a city holding its breath. The story of the 49ers was not just a story of championships and legends. It was a story of survival, a story built from the raw edges of failure, a story that could only rise because it had once fallen. And as I stood there, I understood that this third journey would not begin with glory. It would begin with the fractures, the doubts, the pressure, the moments when the team questioned itself, the moments when the city wondered whether the dream was worth holding on to. The wind moved across the field like a warning. I tightened my jacket around my shoulders and took a slow breath. I felt the past gathering around me, ready to pull me in, ready to show me another side of the story, a side that I had not seen before, a side that would reveal the cost of becoming a legend. I took one final look at the darkened stadium and then spoke quietly into the silence around me. I am ready. And with that, the story opened.
The past did not reveal itself gently this time. It came with a rush, like a cold wind cutting through layers of memory. When I stepped out of the stadium and began walking along the outer path, the world around me shifted. The street lights dimmed in my mind, replaced by the hazy glow of another era. The pavement beneath my feet grew rougher, older, almost uneven. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the sensations settle. When I opened them again, I was standing in the echo of a San Francisco that felt far more fragile than the city I knew. The late 1940s were not a polished age. The streets were crowded with a mix of exhaustion and ambition. People returned from war with lines of fatigue etched across their faces. Others carried dreams that felt larger than their circumstances. The city smelled of coal smoke, salt water, machine oil, and hope. It was in this unsettled landscape that the idea of the 49ers was forged not in comfort, but in defiance. I imagined Tony Morabito walking quickly down a narrow sidewalk, a stack of papers tucked under his arm, his mind racing as he tried to convince established football owners that a team on the West Coast was not madness. He must have felt the weight of every rejection. I saw him stepping into offices filled with cigar smoke and skeptical expressions. I heard the polite dismissals, the quiet laughter behind his back, the subtle whispers that he was chasing something impossible. And yet, he kept going. He had seen something others had not. He believed that San Francisco was ready for a team that could match the fire of the city's people. I pictured him late at night in his small office, the desk lamp casting a dim circle of light across scattered notes. He traced maps, calculated travel distances, and imagined schedules in a league that still treated the West like unexplored territory. The thought of starting a team so far from the league's center required more than enthusiasm. It required a stubborn belief that the future belonged to those willing to shape it. I sensed his frustration during the nights when doubt crept in. I sensed the relief on the night when a door finally opened, when someone finally agreed to give him a chance. The birth of the 49ers in 1946 was not greeted with fireworks or fanfare. It was met with curiosity, confusion, and a little disbelief. People wondered whether a professional team could survive in a city so far from the rest of the league. They wondered whether fans would care. They wondered whether players would even want to come. But the city had always been a place of risk-takers, and the arrival of the team sparked something in people's imaginations. I pictured the first players stepping off trains with suitcases in hand. Many were young men who had grown up far from the coast. Some had served in the war. Some had played in smaller leagues. All of them were stepping into uncertainty. They did not have luxurious facilities or expensive gear. They had grit, raw talent, and the chance to be part of something new. I imagine them walking into a modest locker room with chipped paint on the walls and metal lockers that rattled whenever they closed. The air was cold and carried the smell of sweat, leather, and anticipation.
Their practices took place on fields that were sometimes muddy, sometimes uneven, sometimes barely maintained. But the players pushed through every drill with determination. I imagined linemen grinding through sled drills as coaches shouted through the wind. I saw receivers running crisp routes across grass slick with morning dew. I saw quarterbacks wiping dirt from their jerseys after falling hard on a rough patch of turf. There was nothing glamorous about these moments, and yet these moments formed the foundation of everything the team would become. The city began to notice, not quickly, but steadily. People started showing up to watch practices. Not many at first, maybe a few dozen, then more. Soon, small crowds formed at the edge of the field, hands in pockets, breath visible in the cold air, eyes fixed on the players who were trying so hard to prove themselves. These were the earliest signs of a bond forming between the team and the people who would one day call themselves lifelong fans. I imagined the first home game. The stadium was not full, but it was alive. The crowd buzzed with a mix of curiosity and cautious excitement. Children climbed onto railings to get a better view. Vendors shouted over the noise, selling snacks and warm drinks. The air smelled of roasted peanuts, damp grass, and the ocean breeze drifting inland. The players stepped onto the field knowing that the eyes of a city were on them. Their nerves must have been electric. The game itself was rough. Mistakes were made, tempers flared, but there were moments of brilliance too. A long run that split through defenders, a pass thrown with perfect timing, a tackle that shook the entire stadium. These flashes lit sparks in the crowd. People began to cheer, first politely, then louder, until the noise grew into something powerful. The team felt it. The city felt it. Something was happening. Something real. Of course, the early years were not filled with endless success. The team lost games they should have won. They fought inconsistent seasons. Injuries hit key players. Coaches debated strategy in smoky rooms late into the night. There were dark moments when the future felt uncertain. I imagined Tony Morabito sitting alone in the stands after a disappointing loss, the stadium empty around him. He must have questioned his own dream on those nights. And yet, he kept believing. What struck me most about this period was how the identity of the 49ers began to form quietly, not through trophies, but through resilience. The city admired that resilience. San Francisco was a place rebuilt after disaster, a place where people learned to endure and push forward even when the world tried to break them. The team mirrored those values without even realizing it. That was why the people connected with them. They saw their own spirit reflected on the field. I imagined a moment late in one of those early seasons, a close game, a tense crowd, a final drive that required perfect execution. I saw the quarterback crouch behind the center, his breath visible in the cold air. I saw the linemen shift their weight, the running back bouncing slightly on his toes. The snap came, the play unfolded. A short pass flew through the air, caught just beyond the reach of defenders. The crowd erupted. It was only one win, but it felt like a promise that greatness could grow from struggle. As I stepped deeper into the memory of those years, I felt the weight of everything the team had gone through before their rise. The doubt, the pressure, the small victories that meant everything. These moments shaped the soul of the franchise long before the world recognized their greatness. This was not the polished foundation of a dynasty. It was the raw, imperfect beginning of a team learning to survive. And survival was the first step towards becoming unforgettable.
The years that followed did not rise with steady optimism. They rose with conflict, pressure, the sharp edge of expectation cutting against the raw spirit of a team still learning who it was supposed to become. When I stepped into this part of the story, I felt the weight of that tension settle across my shoulders like a heavy coat. The 49ers were no longer simply fighting to exist. Now they were fighting to matter. And that battle shaped the next chapter of their rise with a speed and intensity that neither the team nor the city was truly prepared for. I imagined the early 50s unfolding with a mix of hope and urgency. The players were stronger, faster, more confident than the group that had formed the foundation years earlier. They walked into practice with a sharper edge in their movements. The locker room carried a louder pulse. There was pride in their eyes, but also frustration. They knew they had potential. They knew they were close. But close was never enough. Not in this city, not in this league, and certainly not for the players who had begun to see the possibility of greatness sitting just beyond their reach. I imagined the practice field during those rising seasons. The wind blew cold from the bay, carrying dust in thin fog across the uneven grass. Coaches stood with clipboards tucked against their chests, watching players grind through drills with relentless effort. The sound of helmets clashing echoed through the air. The ground shook with the impact of hard hits. Sweat dripped onto the dirt as players pushed their bodies until their chests throbbed with exhaustion. These practices were no longer about forming a team. They were about sharpening a blade. The city sensed the shift as well. Crowds grew larger at games. Newspapers wrote more about the team. Children pointed excitedly at the players when they passed through the streets. There was a new tone in the conversations across cafes and street corners. It was not blind belief, and it was not doubt. It was something in between, something cautious. The city was waiting for the team to prove that the rise they sensed was real, waiting for the moment that would transform quiet hope into blazing pride. I imagined one particular season that began with fierce intensity. The opening games brought moments of brilliance that fueled excitement through the city. The offense moved with a rhythm that felt more controlled. The defense struck with force. The players looked as if they had finally found the identity they had been searching for since the beginning. But brilliance is fragile, and in those early years, it did not take much to crack the surface. Injury struck like a sudden storm. A key player fell in practice. Another suffered a blow during a crucial game. The roster thinned. Doubt crept back in. Coaches argued behind closed doors. Fans grew restless. It was as if every time the team climbed a few steps, the ground shifted beneath them. I imagined players sitting quietly in the locker room after a painful loss, staring at the floor, replaying mistakes in their minds. They had tasted what success could feel like. Losing now felt sharper than before. But even in the midst of struggle, something powerful was forming. The team learned to adjust. They learned to fight through games when the odds leaned heavily against them. They learned to rely on young players who had once stood in the shadows, waiting for a chance they were not sure would ever come. I imagined one of those young players walking onto the field for the first time with shaking hands, then delivering a performance that stunned everyone. Moments like that created sparks that pushed the team forward. The coaching staff worked with a kind of desperate creativity. They adjusted their strategies, rearranged the roster, and changed their approach mid-season more than once. Late-night film sessions blurred into early morning practices. The lights in the facility stayed on for hours after the players had gone home. The coaches knew they were close to something special, and that closeness drove them to push harder than ever before. Some games in those years were battles that etched themselves into the bones of the franchise. I imagined one fierce matchup against a dominant rival. The stadium roared with a kind of wild energy that made the air vibrate. The game was a back-and-forth struggle, each team trading blows like heavyweight fighters refusing to fall. The crowd held its breath with every pass, every tackle, every sudden burst of speed. And although the 49ers did not win that game, something changed. They walked off the field with their heads high. They had proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the best. Another moment etched itself into the rise. A cold afternoon game that seemed destined for failure. The rain fell in sheets. The wind cut through jerseys like knives. The offense struggled. The defense faltered. Fans braced for disappointment. And then, out of nowhere, a player made a play that defied logic. A deep catch made in impossible conditions. A run that broke through defenders who had seemed immovable. A final drive that felt powered not by skill alone, but by sheer refusal to give in. The team won, and the city felt the tremor of something awakening. The rise continued through these moments of grit and resilience. These wins were not polished. They were not elegant. They were carved from effort and pain. But they moved the team forward. They tightened bonds. They shaped a culture rooted in endurance. And endurance is often the first sign that greatness is approaching. I imagined the team in the locker room near the end of one of those rising seasons. The players sat in a circle, sweat dripping from their faces, lungs burning from the effort of a hard-fought victory. The coach stood in front of them, eyes sharp with intensity. He reminded them that the road ahead would not be kind. He reminded them that the rise was not complete. He reminded them that every moment from this point on would define who they became. As I stepped deeper into this part of the past, I felt the shift building. The rise was no longer quiet. It was no longer subtle. It had become a force, a growing current pulling the team towards something bigger than the city could yet imagine. The turning point was close. I could feel it hovering at the edge of the story like a brewing storm. The team was ready for it, even if they didn't know it yet.
The turning point did not explode into the story. It slid in like a shadow stretching across the ground, subtle at first, then unmistakable. When I stepped into this chapter of the past, I felt the air around me tighten. Everything the team had endured, every rise and fall, every narrow victory and painful loss had led to this moment. The shift was not only tactical, it was emotional, psychological, cultural. The 49ers were about to discover the kind of transformation that changes not just the season, but the entire identity of a franchise. It began, as so many turning points do, with a single decision. I imagine the meeting room where it happened, the blinds half open, letting in a thin beam of light, papers scattered across a long wooden table, the air heavy with tension. Coaches sat with arms crossed, deep in thought. Front office members leaned forward, eyes fixed on the person at the head of the table. The discussion was sharp, measured, and filled with uncertainty. The team had reached a crossroads. Something had to change, something deep. Then a new voice entered the picture, a coach with a reputation for seeing the game differently. A man who carried himself with calm intelligence, yet held an intensity beneath the surface that could fill a room. When he spoke, the others listened. He outlined a philosophy that challenged everything the team had known. He talked about precision, discipline, and a system that required absolute commitment. He spoke about unity, about purpose, about shaping not just plays, but mindsets. And as he talked, the room shifted. Doubt turned to curiosity. Curiosity turned to conviction. The decision was made. A new era began. I imagined the first practice under his leadership. The field looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. The players jogged out with a sense of anticipation, unsure what to expect. The new coach stood at the center of the field, hands behind his back, eyes sharp. He did not shout. He did not posture. He spoke simply and clearly. The expectations would be higher. The margin for error would shrink. The work would be harder. The team would either rise to meet the new standard or be left behind. It was not a threat. It was a truth. The drills that followed were harsher than anything the players had experienced. Routes had to be exact. Footwork had to be clean. Assignments had to be understood, not guessed. Mistakes were corrected immediately. Lazy habits were crushed. The players who embraced the system found themselves improving quickly. Those who resisted struggled to keep up. The coach watched every movement, offering quiet instruction, firm correction, and rare but powerful words of praise. Slowly, the team began to transform. I imagine the locker room during these early days. Some players sat in silence, reviewing notes and diagrams with newfound seriousness. Others taped their hands with a mixture of frustration and determination. The conversations were different now. There was less joking, less drifting focus. The players were beginning to understand the gravity of the moment. The team was no longer building, it was being rebuilt. A key part of this shift came with the arrival of new talent. I imagined a young quarterback walking into the facility for the first time. He was calm, focused, and carried a quiet confidence that set him apart. When he threw the ball, it cut through the air with startling precision. When he spoke, his voice carried steady conviction. Teammates noticed, coaches noticed, the city noticed. There was something different about him, something that suggested he was the missing piece the team had been waiting for. But he was not the only one. A defensive player with fierce intensity began to shape the identity of the other side of the ball. A receiver with effortless speed added a new dimension to the offense. A veteran leader stepped forward in the locker room, guiding younger players with the weight of his experience. The team was no longer just a roster, it was a structure, each piece supporting the next. I imagined the first game after these changes took hold. The stadium buzzed with tension. Fans felt something stirring, though they could not yet define it. The players took the field with a new sense of purpose. Their movements were sharper, their eyes were focused. The quarterback scanned the field with calm determination. The defense shifted with disciplined precision. The energy in the stadium changed the moment the ball was snapped. The offense executed like a machine. Quick passes, sharp routes, perfect timing. The ball moved down the field with a rhythm the city had never seen before. The defense responded with equal intensity. They swarmed to the ball. They read plays with uncanny awareness. They hit with a force that sent a message to every opponent watching. This was not the same team. The game was not just a win, it was a revelation. Fans stood in stunned silence before erupting into cheers that echoed through the city. The analysts watching from afar immediately rewrote their assessments. Something new had arrived. A force, a future, a beginning that carried the promise of greatness. But the turning point was not defined by a single game. It was defined by consistency. Week after week, the team played with the same precision, intensity, and unity. They still made mistakes, but their response to those mistakes was different. They adapted quickly. They learned even faster. They trusted the system. They trusted each other. That trust became their weapon. I imagine the coach walking down the hallway late at night, the lights low, the facility quiet. He stopped to look through the window at the darkened field. In that moment, he knew the team had accepted his vision. He knew they had begun to believe. And he knew the next chapter would push them into the storm of greatness that awaited. The city could feel the shift in every conversation. Fans spoke with excitement that bordered on disbelief. The team they had supported through struggle, heartbreak, and years of rebuilding was finally stepping into something extraordinary. The turning point was complete. The identity had been forged. And as I stepped out of that moment in the past, I felt the thunder of the approaching storm. The climax was coming. Nothing could stop it now.
The storm arrived with a force that felt almost unreal. When I stepped into this part of the story, I could feel the air thicken around me, as if the very atmosphere understood what was coming. Everything the team had endured, every shift in culture, every hard practice and late-night meeting had built toward this moment. They were no longer a team searching for identity. They were a team ready to dominate. The rise was over. The turning point had reshaped them. Now they stood in the center of the storm, prepared to seize greatness with both hands. I imagined the first game of the season that marked their transformation. The stadium shook with anticipation. Fans filled every seat, the noise rolling in waves across the field. The players stepped onto the grass with a confidence that radiated from their movements. They had walked through doubt and discipline. They had survived pressure and adversity. Now they carried an aura of inevitability. They were not here to prove anything. They were here to claim what they believed was already theirs. The opening drive was a declaration. The quarterback stood tall behind the line, eyes scanning the field with calm precision. He took the snap, dropped back, and released a pass that cut through the air like a blade. The receiver caught it in stride and sprinted upfield as the crowd erupted. The offense moved with smooth, relentless rhythm, each player executing with a kind of unified brilliance that no opponent seemed prepared for. They crossed the goal line, touchdown, and the season had barely begun. The defense answered with equal intensity. I imagine the opposing offense lining up, confident in their own preparation, only to be met with a wall of furious discipline. The defensive line exploded off the snap, forcing chaos in the backfield. The linebackers read every movement with uncanny instinct. The secondary closed gaps before the ball even arrived. A crushing hit echoed across the stadium, followed by roaring approval from the crowd. This was not the defense of earlier years. This was a force that choked the life out of drives. Week after week, the team delivered performances that felt almost surreal. They won close games with precision. They dominated blowouts with ruthless efficiency. They weathered tough matchups with calm resilience. I imagined the city transforming alongside them. Conversations shifted from hope to excitement, from excitement to confidence, from confidence to something deeper, belief. Fans walked the streets wearing the colors of the team with a pride that felt almost electric. Children practiced plays in parks with the intensity of professionals. Bars stayed filled on game nights. The city moved with the pulse of the team. One game stood above the rest, a late-season matchup against an opponent widely regarded as the strongest in the league. Analysts called it a test. Fans called it a preview of destiny. The stadium buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation. I imagine the players warming up, focused and silent, their movements slow and deliberate. The quarterback threw warm-up passes with the same precision he brought to every game. The defense moved like a pack of predators preparing for the hunt. When the game began, the storm unleashed itself. The opening minutes were chaotic. Both teams traded blows with fierce determination. The crowd roared with every big play. The score stayed tight, but then something shifted. The 49ers found a rhythm. The offense surged forward with unstoppable momentum. The quarterback threaded passes into windows that seemed impossible. The receivers caught everything thrown their way. The running backs burst through openings with explosive power. The defense rose even higher. A perfectly timed interception sent shockwaves through the stadium. A brutal sack left the opposing quarterback shaken. Every inch of the field was contested, and every contested moment seemed to tilt in the 49ers' favor. The sidelines radiated intensity. Coaches leaned into their play sheets. Players shouted encouragement and reminders. The crowd noise swelled until it felt like the stadium itself was alive. Then came the defining moment. Late in the fourth quarter, the game tied, the tension unbearable. The 49ers took the field for what felt like a final statement. I imagine the quarterback stepping up to the line, the stadium holding its breath. The ball snapped. He dropped back, the pocket collapsing around him. For a moment, everything slowed. Then he moved, escaping pressure with a fluid motion, eyes locked downfield. He launched the ball with perfect timing, sending it in a high arc toward the end zone. The receiver sprinted, leapt, and caught the ball with outstretched hands just as his feet hit the painted grass. Touchdown! The stadium exploded with a roar that felt powerful enough to shake the city itself. Fans embraced strangers. Players sprinted down the field in celebration. Coaches pumped their fists. The moment was not just a score. It was a declaration of dominance. It was the moment when the entire league understood that a new force had arrived. From that point forward, the path to the playoffs felt almost inevitable. The team continued to win, each game adding to the growing legend. I imagine the locker room late in the season, the air thick with the smell of sweat and adrenaline. Players sat in focused silence or shared brief smiles. Coaches reviewed strategies knowing they were preparing for the highest level of competition. The playoffs arrived with massive weight. Every game mattered. Every decision carried consequences. But the team did not break under the pressure. They rose through it. They won with precision. They fought through tough moments with resilience. They adapted, adjusted, and advanced. Then came the championship game. The sky above the stadium glowed with bright lights, the noise of thousands of fans vibrating through the structure. I imagined the players standing on the sideline before kickoff, their breath visible in the cool night air. Their eyes were sharp, Their bodies were coiled with tension and readiness. They knew the stakes. They embraced them. The game was a battle from the first whistle, but the 49ers moved with purpose. The offense struck with precision. The defense crushed critical drives. The momentum swung, then settled firmly in their favor. Every play built upon the last until finally, in the closing minutes, the victory became undeniable. When the final whistle sounded, the stadium erupted into chaos and joy. Confetti fell from the sky like golden dust drifting through the lights. Players raised their arms, coaches embraced each other, fans cried, cheered, and shouted the team's name into the night. The storm had reached its peak. This was the climax written into their legacy.
When the storm of celebration finally drifted into the quiet hours of the night, I felt the story shift once again. The climax had struck with the force of destiny, but the aftermath carried a different weight, a softer weight, a reflective one. As I stepped into this final chapter, the noise of victory faded behind me like distant thunder, and the calm that followed revealed the truth that every great story eventually faces. Triumph is loud. Legacy is quiet. I imagined the stadium long after the fans had gone home. The light still glowed softly against the dark sky, casting warm halos across the empty seats. Confetti clung to the edges of the turf in scattered patches, drifting lightly when the wind moved. It was peaceful, almost sacred. The chaos from hours before had settled into a memory, and the field stood as a quiet witness to everything that had been achieved. I stepped onto the turf in my mind, letting the silence fill the space around me. It felt like standing in the heart of something that would outlast everyone who had contributed to it. The locker room was quieter too. Players sat with slumped shoulders, their bodies exhausted, their faces calm. Some stared at the floor with faint smiles, lost in the swirl of emotion that follows a dream realized. Others leaned back against their lockers, eyes closed, letting the exhaustion melt into relief. I imagined a veteran player holding his helmet in both hands, running his thumbs along the scratches and scuffs that marked the long season. Each mark told a story. Each bruise on his body carried meaning. He had fought for this, and now that the battle was over, he allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. Coaches gathered in a small room nearby. Their voices were low, their smiles tired but genuine. The head coach sat at the center of the group, leaning forward with hands clasped. His eyes were distant, but not with worry, with gratitude. He knew what it had taken to reach this point. He knew the long nights spent studying film, the tension of losses, the pressure of expectations, and the resilience required to steady a team through doubt. Championships are built on 1,000 invisible decisions, and he had carried each one with quiet determination. Now, surrounded by the people who had walked through the fire with him, he allowed a rare sense of peace to settle. Outside the stadium, the city pulsed with celebration. Streets filled with people waving flags and wearing jerseys. Cars honked in steady rhythm. Voices echoed through alleyways and across intersections. Families gathered on balconies. Bars overflowed with cheers. The team had given the city something beautiful, a memory that would stitch itself into the identity of every person who had followed the journey. This victory was not just a sports achievement, it was a reflection of the city's endurance, resilience, and pride. In the days that followed, the noise slowly faded, replaced by reflection. The players rested, the coaches exhaled. The city returned to its rhythm, though now with a brighter heartbeat. I imagined a young fan sitting at a kitchen table early one morning, staring at a clipping from the newspaper. His eyes were wide with admiration. He traced the outline of the trophy with his finger, imagining himself one day standing where his heroes had stood. These moments, quiet and personal, were the threads that stitched legacy into the future. At the training facility, the trophy was placed in a glass case under soft lights. Players walked by it with a mixture of pride and responsibility. Some paused to look at their reflections in the glass. Others barely glanced at it, already thinking about the next season, the next challenge, the next step in the journey. Great teams do not dwell on triumphs. They honor them, then move forward. The coaching staff met again much sooner than many expected. Plans for the following season were already forming. Roster decisions needed attention, strategies required adjustments. The victory had set a new standard, and maintaining that standard would require discipline. Success was never permanent. They understood that better than anyone. The quiet after the championship was not an ending. It was a reset, a breath taken before the next push. Months passed. The confetti was cleaned, the banners were hung, yet the memory of the season lived in every corner of the city. Murals appeared on buildings, painted in vivid colors that captured the brightest moments. Schools held assemblies celebrating the team. Radio hosts discussed the new era that had arrived. The city had embraced its champions completely. I imagined walking back into the stadium during the off-season. The seats were empty again. The field was pristine, the lines freshly painted. The air was still. I stood at the center of the field and let my eyes travel across the vast bowl of seats rising around me. How many stories had unfolded here? How many dreams had begun, ended, or been rewritten within these walls? The silence felt heavy, but not in a somber way. It felt powerful. Legacies are not built on noise. They are built on moments like these, moments when the world is quiet enough to hear the truth beneath the victories. The truth is that the 49ers had earned their greatness not through one season or one game, but through decades of effort. Through early struggles, rising hope, turning points, and the storm of brilliance that had become their defining era. As I walked toward the exit, I realized that the story I had followed through 3 different journeys always led to the same revelation. The 49ers were more than a team. They were a living memory, a reflection of a city that had learned to rise from fire, from doubt, from hardship. Their story was not defined by trophies. It was defined by persistence. I stepped outside into the fading light of evening. The sky glowed with soft colors. The breeze carried the faint scent of ocean salt. I looked back at the stadium one last time. It felt alive, even in silence, a keeper of stories that would continue long after mine ended. The resolution of the journey settled around me like warm fog rolling in from the bay. The climax had burned bright, but this quiet truth felt just as powerful. The legacy was intact, the future was open. And as I walked away, I knew the story would continue with every new season, every new player, every new dreamer who believed that greatness could rise again.